All right. I'm always so happy when that works. All right, let's get started. So, as the founder of Trace Labs, which I'll talk about in a minute, I often get asked by our community, how do I get better at OSINT? And it's a fairly straightforward question, which I usually give a very brief answer to because just of the time restrictions and stuff with a lot of my interactions. So I'll say, oh, go read that book by Michael Bazell, or go listen to that podcast. But it's not really the best answer, right? So today's mission for me is to really answer that question for you, right? And to give a more detailed answer. And to do that within my background as a tracker for search and rescue. So I have over a decade of tracking experience, tracking out in the woods, looking for lost people in the forests and mountains of British Columbia, Canada. And I'm going to compare that with how we do OSINT today to give you some insights in how we can do that better. I look at thousands of OSINT submissions every CTF, and we do multiple CTFs every year. We used to do one every month with Trace Labs. So I've got this unique combination of the SAR tracking background for over a decade, multiple lost persons we found, plus the Trace Labs, thousands of OSINT CTF submissions that I'm comparing, right? So kind of a unique field of knowledge, that combination, and hopefully that's going to allow us to get some details and some improvements to our overall OSINT. So a quick background of who I am in case we haven't met. I'm the founder of Trace Labs. Trace Labs, for those of you that haven't seen us before, we're a nonprofit organization operating around the world at different events. During COVID, we went online only. We did virtual CTFs, which would be about 650 contestants. Usually that's about just under 100 sort of admin staff that help support that, so pretty big events. We crowdsource open source intelligence to help law enforcement find real missing persons. So these are actual missing people that we're collecting intel on, and then we generate a report based off of that and provide that to law enforcement to help them find missing persons. Just a couple of these pictures here. The top left is when we went to Australia to do a big event, and it was #1 on the news for that particular day. I walked into the hotel room, turned on the TV, and there I was, which is a surreal experience. And the title is quite interesting, right? Because it says something like hackers hunting down missing people, which was kind of alarming for me, because poor choice of words probably. And then below that, I'm in Latvia talking to some emergency management people at a conference on how to crowdsource open source intelligence, which is becoming increasingly popular in these different industries. And then top right is me in my SAR capacity in a helicopter going out into the field. And then bottom right is me hunting up in northern BC, which ties into my tracking, right? I have a history. I've grown up on Quadra Island, which is on the west coast of Canada, very remote, very small island. So I have that kind of, ever since I was a teenager, I've been tracking. So it gives you a bit of an idea of who I am. I've been a tracker in search and rescue for over a decade, a very diverse experience there. Everything from marine rescue to mountain rescue to just tracking people in the bush. So that's generally who I am. Alpha Omega is a new initiative that I'll be launching next year. It's really focused on helping corporations detect corporate espionage. So if you're into that, let's have a beer or a coffee. I'd love to get your insights into that. So that's me. Quick disclaimer, nothing that I talk about here today has anything to do with any of my employers, lawful use only. It's all public information. Also, OSINT is rapidly changing, so anything that we talk about today could change tomorrow. And while I have deep experience in both of these two fields, I never say I'm an expert. I always look for input and collaboration. So if you've got some input into any of the materials here, please let me know afterwards. I'm really thrilled to meet people who are passionate about this, who want to have a discussion. All right, so really the meat of what we're going to be talking about here today is the comparison between physical tracking out in the bush, a 3-person team, detecting the signs in the forest to go find that lost person. Sometimes they're just a lost recreational hiker. Sometimes they could be criminal activity. It varies, but the process is pretty similar. We're going to compare that to OSINT, right, which is a relatively new discipline, right, in the grand scheme of things. It's depending on the internet. The internet hasn't been around that long. For me, my lifespan, it occurred during my lifespan, right? Some of you have probably been used to the internet your whole life, but it's relatively new. Tracking, on the other hand, is not new. Tracking's been around pretty much forever. I think it probably originated when we looked at animals and went, those might be tasty. And we started tracking them, right? So it's been around a long time, and as a result, we have a pretty good framework around how to track people and animals and how to do it effectively. So I'm going to compare those two things because there's a lot that we can bring over to OSINT to make our lives easier and to produce a better quality product. A roadmap, I put this in here because I always want to know where I'm going, right? I want to know, okay, what's the point of this? Where are we going? What am I going to get out of it? So what I hope to deliver here today is an introduction to physical tracking. Many of you are probably not familiar with physical tracking, so I want to give you a little bit of an insight, a little bit of a teaser into what it's all about, and then give you also some insights into what we do at Trace Labs and what I see at Trace Labs. As the founder of Trace Labs, right now, my job really is to do quality control on the incoming submissions. So I basically see this waterfall of intel coming in during our CTFs. And I'm seeing everything, the good, the bad, everything in between. So it gives me a pretty good perspective of what's working and what doesn't. And that's what I'm going to give you some introductions into today. And then I like to try to summarize content so you can come away with a clear message. So I'm going to give you 12 recommendations to improve your OSINT. I was going to try to do 10, but I just have too many important things I want to try to get across. So I settled on 12. And then finally, we're not going to do Q&A, I don't think, unless we have some time left over, but I'm happy to meet with you afterwards and discuss any of these details, and actually I look forward to that. All right, we're going to start off with preparation. And I know you're probably thinking, oh, Rob, preparation. Everybody does preparation, of course. It's super basic, right? I see so many people fail at this most basic step of preparation, right? And in the search and rescue world, if you're not prepared, somebody could die. People have died, right? So you go out into the woods, you don't have the proper preparations, you're a day's travel from civilization, the helicopter can't come in to pick you up because it's stormy, you get hypothermia, you're in a lot of problems, right? We've had people in Swiftwater, same thing, really bad result. So preparations is an ongoing activity every day. So we're doing training, we're going through our gear. One of the latest things is I got rid of my AA batteries and replaced it with a USB battery pack. I'm always testing, preparing, learning, training, collaborating. Same thing with OSINT, right? So even if you're a brand new OSINT person and you're rolling into one of our CTFs, just a little bit of preparation is going to set you apart from everyone else, right? And I would encourage, if you're doing this as a job for an employer, this should be something that you're continually doing, continually working on, right? Whether it be setting up your environments, learning the new tools, setting up your sock puppets. We had a great presentation yesterday, I think, on sock puppets. That in and of itself could be a huge area you could invest some time, right? Are you going to be taking your OSINT to court? Right? Is it that important? Do you have a dedicated VM for that? Are you polluting your environments? Things like that. Really understand that. So recommendation number 1, allow preparations to take more time than the operation. The operation should really be a pretty small investment in comparison to everything else, right? A lot of people don't do that. So that's number 1. Number 2, and again, we're still at the most basic level. We're going to get more sophisticated here in a minute. But the objective. Make sure you understand what you're setting out to do. And this happens both on the search and rescue tracking side as well as the OSINT side quite a bit. On the search and rescue side, we go into the van, the command vehicle, and they say, hey, go look for that person over there. It's like, yeah, I need more than that. I need to know, like, why are we looking for this person? What's the details of the person? What's the weather? What's the terrain going to be like? Do I need to take all my rope rescue gear? Right? How far ahead is that person? What's their state of mind, their medical condition? Who's on my team? What's my team's skill set, right? So when we start off, usually the SAR team will be a 4-person team, a tracking team will be 3 people. I want to know what their skill set is. So I'll ask them, what's your level of first aid? Do you know the communications? Do you know navigation? And then I'll assign them those duties, right, based on their skill sets. So the most qualified person is doing that. So we'll split it up that way. Are you doing that when you're doing OSINT with your teams? Are you going through skill sets and familiarity and where they can specialize, right? So really looking at that. So many times in a CTF, people will come in and they'll be like, oh, there's no power. What am I supposed to do, right? So also that sort of stuff, preparing for that. Where are you operating? Make sure you know that. Make sure that where's your teammates? How are they going to operate? Collecting all those details. So recommendation number 2, ensure you understand the objective, and then also make sure that everyone else is on the same page as you. And that's going to be really important later as we talk about how to proceed further. Sign. So now we're going to move up a level in our sophistication. Sign. As a tracker, I'm not looking for the subject. I don't expect to walk into the woods and go, oh, there he is, right? That almost never happens. What I'm looking for is signs. So any indication of the person. So that could be, for me, broken branches, litter. There was a classic search I was on. I called it the Old Milwaukee search, where I was finding an empty beer can every kilometer. So it was like connecting the dots of beer cans until we eventually found them. And they were really interesting characters. So they were looking for the lake, and there is no lake anywhere near that area. But so you're looking for signs. So stop trying to immediately say, oh yeah, there they are right there, and start collecting sign. And in OSINT, of course, that can be various things like social media platforms, their forum posts, any sort of indication of online activity, right? Assets, digital assets, physical assets that you see online, their business, anything like that that you can start collecting. Now, we're looking for sign, but there's different types of sign, right? There's conclusive and substantiating. And you don't need to remember those words necessarily. I think that you can just think of, okay, what's proven to be sign from the subject? And I say subject, meaning the person you're looking for or the entity or whatever else. Sorry, it's a search and rescue term. I should have mentioned that before. But you really need to make sure you're not confusing the two, conclusive and substantiating. And this is one of the biggest things I see in the Trace Labs events where teams come in and they start doing their OSINT. They find a Facebook page of a person with the same name as the subject, and it kind of looks like them, right? So it's like, that's them. And then they work for hours collecting intelligence on that person, but it's not them. And so after a few hours, it's really embarrassing to say like, oh, sorry, but by the way, that's not the same person. So really understanding what is conclusive and what's substantiating, and then always verifying that. So one of the things we do as a tracker is when we find the initial footprints, we're actually taking a picture of that. We're drawing it as well, because drawing will actually give us some better shading of that. And we're making sure that we have a solid foundation to start off from, right? So I've got four examples there, right? 2 of them are conclusive and 2 of them are substantiating, right? So if law enforcement has given you something, typically they're the authority on that, so you can guess that that's going to be actually legit, as well as the family, right? This family has given us some subject clothing, so they would know if it's the subject's clothing or not, rather than say just a video of the subject or a random boot print, right? So the picture here of the 2 people, right? Same person or not, right? It's so hard to tell these days. So you continually want to be verifying, is this the person I'm looking for? Because quite often, it's not. All right, we've got sign, we've got the types of sign. Now we're starting to look at sign pattern, okay? Sign pattern indicates the habits or particulars of a subject. So for me, out in the bush, I'm starting to pick up sign. I'm looking at the footprints. I'm looking at the trash that they're throwing down. I'm looking at the direction of travel. So now I'm starting to understand, are they getting tired? Are they trying to evade me? Are they now injured? Things like that. I'm starting to clue into that, right? So recommendation number 5 is utilize sign to allow you to see sign patterns, because patterns are predictive. So now we can start to understand our subject a little bit better, right? Which is really important. Quite often I will see them start to change their habits as they start to get tired, run out of food, things like that. And you can see the same thing within OSINT. So sign patterns are very similar, right, when we're looking at OSINT. You're starting to look at tendencies, habits, lifestyle change, username, picture, and password reuse. We talk a lot about password reuse. But when you're doing OSINT, you can start off with username and picture reuse, and you can do a lot of work there. I always recommend for new teams to start looking at that, right? One of the problems with Trace Labs with the platform, and I'm the first to admit it, is we don't focus on sign pattern very much. We've gamified this very serious thing, and it works pretty well, but I would love it if we could focus more on the actual sign pattern for our contestants. But you as an individual OSINTer, you can do that, right? You can do that and document it and start to focus on that. So going from sign to understanding the types of sign, to then sign pattern, to finally forming a tracking picture. Now from this, we're getting a really good idea of what's going on with the person that we're looking for. And this is important because this is ultimately where we want to get, because things are going to get more difficult usually as we proceed, right? As time goes on, the weather may wash away the tracks in the physical world, but also in the virtual world when you're doing OSINT, people may start deleting their posts and things like that. So time is usually a sensitive variable here, right? So in this particular example, and this is very, very common. I've tried to use a few very common examples from my world. So this particular one, right? So a person moving on the trail, steady pace, not stopping. So with those sort of things, I'm going to radio into command, and I'm going to say, hey, we got a fit outdoorsy male, too fast for my single team to catch, because we're going to be actually fairly slow, even on a trail. Requires interception, use the trail system to block. So they'll just go to the next tee, put a team there, and intercept that person. That's pretty straightforward. We call it sign cutting, where you'll go up ahead with another team. And we'll do that quite a bit to make up time. So tracking picture in search and rescue is really important. But also when you're doing your OSINT, you want to start to figure out what's in their mind. What are they thinking? Why are they doing the behaviors that they're doing? And that's going to help you a lot. Sooner or later, you're going to have to call upon that. And on the OSINT side, it gets a little bit more complicated, I find. Because I find that we often start to speculate. And so this is another example that I see all the time. So we've got some bullet points there of a particular subject. This one is really interesting because the person is not necessarily going to something, they're running away from something, right? So we see this quite a bit with juveniles, where they have a bad home life, could be an element of abuse there, and they just don't want to be there. So they're continually trying to get away, and they're continually brought back. So recommendation number 6 is allow sign patterns to build a tracking picture. So you've gone from sign, types of sign patterns to now tracking picture, rather than just collecting intel. And I find with Trace Labs, we do that very well. Our contestants collect a lot of intel, but it's not often wrapped up in this nice tracking picture, right? And then also don't speculate. So some red flags. If you or your team members start saying words like, I think, perhaps, maybe, well, it's time to kind of reconfirm some of those things, right? What evidence do you have of that? And that's really important. So, because I find most people will tend to slide in that direction because they're trying to fill in the gaps that they don't have any data for. Be very careful of that. Now, we've gone through some different techniques, but now all of a sudden we reach a point in the exercise where there's no more sign. And this is the point where things fall apart. Both in the physical world as a tracker, people can get very disappointed with this and tend to give up, as well as with OSINT, right? Usually in a Trace Lab CTF, we have 4 subjects, because I know that at least one of them is going to be very difficult. And probably with the others, you're going to run out of sign at some point, or get stuck perhaps, and then you're going to want to switch to another one. And so we see that quite a bit. You go as far as you can, and then it gets hard, and you're like, okay, I give up on that one. I'm going to move over to this other person. If you're doing this as a job, or for me, out in the forest, I don't have any other options. It's this person, that's what I'm getting told to find, right? I can't just say, oh, I give up, right? That doesn't happen. So you have to shift gears here a little bit. And it's a bit of a mindset change that you have to do. So you're no longer tracking at this point, right? So you've switched from tracking now to more what I would call hunting. So, and a hunter's mindset, you're now trying to anticipate and think like the thing you're hunting, right? So what would this person do? So you're in an area, for me tracking in the forest, the worst thing is I run up into a big granite wall. Maybe it's 100 meters long, and it's just rock. It's very hard to track on that, right? I've tracked on ice before, and I'm on my knees looking at the pine needles that have been pushed into the ice, right? And then it freezes and thaws, and it messes things up, and it's really interesting, but it's time consuming. So that would be another example of this. So shifting gears a little bit, there's a few tricks you can do. One of the tricks that I do out in the field is called the streamline. So I will look ahead. I have direction of travel typically, and usually that's fairly consistent, but they're going to want to avoid certain obstacles. So if there's, say, a stream, a river, a big rock, anything like that they're going to have to go around, I will send another team up to go and look at that. And usually we can tell which way they're going to go based off of the direction of travel, and then we can pick up the sign at that point, right? And not only do we reestablish sign, but we also save a great deal of time because we're now cutting ahead. So that can be very beneficial, right? So even though you're in difficult terrain, you've lost sign, you can no longer find any social media posts, sometimes you can just relax, sit back and consider, okay, well, what would I do if I was them? You know, we know that they're trying to get to Florida. Okay, well, let's go look at some forums that talk about what it's like in Florida with their username, or things like that, right? Shift gears a little bit. So on the OSINT side, there's some specific things that I like to look at, understanding what their social media platforms are. What do they tend to favor, right? Are they a professional, or are they a TikToker, right? Where are they going on that? So maybe there's some similar platforms that you haven't discovered yet that they're on. Using historical data, of course, if they're trying to evade and they've deleted their stuff. For me, depending on your region, North America is going to be slightly different than here, depending on the privacy, but I like to look at taxes, property. I love assets. I love looking at assets, voter registration, court appearances. So in Canada, court appearances are great. I can see what you went to court for. I can see what your aliases were, if those are recorded, right, if you're using aliases. So that's been fantastic. Gaming activity, a lot of us don't realize that a lot of that can be by default public. So not only what are you playing, when are you playing it, what are your achievements? So maybe I want to go play that same game that you're playing, right? Family and friends is usually the go-to for a lot of people in our CTFs, right, as well. And then I always hope that wearables and exercise apps will give us more information, but those have really improved a lot, so it's very hard to use those now. And then bait. So I'm not going to go too deep into bait, but bait, because it's a little bit of a more non-passive technique, and I think I'll talk about that in a minute. But so recommendation number 7 is lack of sign may force you to deploy bait and or switch to a more of a hunting mindset. So bait. I'm just going to get into that briefly. Hunting and bait is a little different, and I don't necessarily advocate it, because in trace labs, we always say we want to have passive OSINT because we don't want to interfere with an ongoing investigation. We don't want to alert the parents or cause any problems. But there may be circumstances where you need to do this because you have no other options, and it's going to work out for your particular exercise, right? So we see this in hunting quite a bit. Where I live, we do, people will use like pit lamping for squid fishing, right? To draw the fish up to the surface. Hunters quite often will put fruit or apples in a field knowing that the animals will come into that field, right? So similar idea. Understanding what the subject wants and then providing that, right? So that could be anything from offering your couch for them to sleep on in the particular city that they're in, or ride sharing or whatever, right? And then allowing them to come in and post, right, in that environment. So you're providing something that may attract them is another technique that you may have to implement. Now we're going to move into some mandates. These are really big in my world. In the more formalized search and rescue world, we use a lot of mandates, a lot of acronyms to kind of keep us on track. And within SAR, we say self-team subject. And what that means is that I have to look after myself first before I can look after my team members next, and then finally the subject. The subject's actually at the very end, because I can't help somebody else if I break my own leg, right? So a lot of our terrain is very treacherous. We have cliffs and fast-moving water and everything else. And if I'm not prepared for all of that, and not just the gear, but also the training and everything like that, then I'm gonna get myself into trouble. I'm going to delay the whole task. My team is then now rescuing me. So all of that, right? And I think that also applies to your OSINT, right? So if you're not prepared, you come in with a team to do a CTF, you're letting them all down. On the tracking side of things, there's also another mandate. It's observe, remember, select and analyze, comprehend, and deduce. And I'm going to quickly go through what that means and how that's going to help you with your OSINT. So on the observation side, I did a fantastic session with a Special Forces member where we actually went out into the bush, we did some camping out there, and one of the things he showed us was not only how to move in the forest, which was really fascinating, but also how to look through the forest, through the different layers. And as a tracker, historically up until that point, I was on the ground a lot. I have knee pads that I wear because you get so sore because you're kneeling on the ground looking at sign for a long time. And so really teaching me that there's more to tracking than just that, right? And that you need to, at some point, stand up and then scan the environment and observe what's going on. Because quite often, like in this picture here, I put the lines in there for kind of rough estimation of where those different fields of view might be. So you can see in this picture, I'm looking, and there's a pretty clear path that leads down into the valley, so that would be a likely path for a subject. There's also a clearing on the next hillside further ahead, right? So I can start to develop some theories of, okay, well, if I was the subject, I would probably end up going down into that valley, maybe towards civilization, or that campsite, or that clearing might be a great campsite further out, right? So maybe another team can go investigate that. I may also see smoke or movement or anything else if I start to shift my view. So recommendation number 8, so during your OSINT operations, especially if you're working in a team, utilizing a varied range of vision to anticipate rather than a strict focus on immediate sign. In typical CTFs, we see people just kind of going after sign very quickly on the immediate focus, okay, what's next? And they're not looking necessarily at the big picture. So having one person, at least in your team, looking at the bigger vision of, okay, well, what about these other factors, right? So part of observation is also OPSEC. And I wasn't quite sure where to fit this in, but I decided to put it in right here because it's so important. A lot of teams will come in that are new to OSINT, and they don't know what OPSEC is, let alone have it implemented, right? Yet it's really important to consider this as you're moving forward. So for physical tracking, I don't always want the people to know that I'm tracking them. And that sounds counterintuitive because if I'm trying to rescue somebody, then wouldn't you think they want to know that you're looking for them? Well, sometimes they generally have an idea because they've called 911, they've called emergency services, so they know that somebody out there is looking for them. But what happens is if they know we're behind them or they hear or see us, then they immediately want to go to us, which we tell them, no, don't do that. Please just stay where you are. Because what happens is they then get hurt and they fall into a gully or a river or something like that, trying to quickly get to where we are. Because they want to get rescued and they want to help us, right? Which is good. So we're usually moving rather stealthily. And it's interesting because there's different factors that come into play there. I generally hear them before I see them by quite a long distance, especially if it's at night. Sometimes I will smell them depending on the wind as well, right? So it's very interesting that way. You develop your night vision after about 45 minutes. And any sort of glare from someone's light or even a radio light will sometimes impair that. And so all your other senses are heightened. On the OSINT side of it, it's the same sort of considerations, right? Making sure that you're not letting them know that you're tracking them. In almost every consideration, that can be bad, right? Because people then freak out. They're like, well, why are you looking for me? So making sure you're well set up for that. You can never go back and fix your OPSEC, right? Once you're burnt, and that's generally never good. Remember. You will not remember. I've never met anybody with an ironclad memory, especially when they're out in the field. So in search and rescue, I have a waterproof notebook, which I use, and I'm writing down things quite often. Very low tech, very basic, right? All my stuff breaks in the field because it ends up going in the river or the rain or falling down a cliff or whatever, right? So a notepad is pretty much foolproof for me. So I use it a lot to write notes, especially that I get from command or when we're giving coordinates and things like that. But for you you're operating in this virtual environment, so you really have so many resources to not only remember what's going on, but then also to collaborate with your team. And it's not just on, oh, I found their Facebook page. It should be more on, okay, do we understand exactly the strategy that we're following here, right? And those sort of details. How are you coordinating, orchestrating your effort? If you have a 4-person team, let's say, who's doing what? When are you changing? When I'm tracking, I have a 3-person team, and you get really tired really quickly, because not only are you moving with a 40-pound pack, but you're also really, really focused. And so we have to switch out. So we'll change who's in the lead, and we'll also change teams and things like that. So when you're doing OSINT during one of our CTFs, we used to run these CTFs for like 6 to 8 hours, and it would just destroy people. And now we do them for 4 hours, because it's more humane. Because you're still locked in, you're focused. I see people roll in when we're at a conference like this, they have their pack of Red Bull and their big monitor, and they're just like ready to do battle, right? And I know what it's like. So trying to remember and coordinate during something like that is difficult. So I really encourage, use Discord or something like that to keep your teams coordinated, and it'll really help. So recommendation number 10, utilize documentation, whether it be online or my little notebook type thing, to keep yourselves on track. Select and analyze. So most of what we see and hear, in both worlds, is not really what we want, right? So there's a lot of noise going on out there, right? And trying to cut through that. So in the SAR world, we have several different techniques that we use. We talk about moving with purpose. So if you're doing, let's say, a rope rescue task, and someone says, go get the rope, they're not saying, go check your Facebook, right? They're like, go get the rope and come back. And they're expecting that very quickly, and they're expecting you not to get hurt when you do it, and things like that. And there's a lot of kind of rules in place on how we move and how we set things up. And if you want to be successful in your OSINT, whether it be a CTF or a job, I would recommend having a similar type of rule set, right? So are you talking about what you're going to get for lunch, or are you focused on what you're doing? How much of the other stuff are you letting in, right? So is somebody going to talk about their day they had yesterday, or are you going to be focused? And there's always going to be a small element of that, right? But I think keeping the small talk to a minimum and really focused on what you're doing is really important. Limit your distractions. Rest as well, right? You're going to get tired. Quite often when you get tired, you start talking nonsense. So understand that. Okay, after 2 hours, we're going to have a coffee break. And then you can chat about the weather or whatever you want to do, right? The other thing is, don't waste time speculating. So when you're selecting and then analyzing the content that you want to look at, web sleuths is something I see all the time in our CTFs, and we just say no. Because it's all about the speculation of, well, maybe this, maybe that. No. So that's something to watch out for as well. Sorry, I'm impaired when moving that forward. Okay, comprehend and deduce. So as you proceed, you're going to be trying to develop sign patterns, and the significance of sign patterns will become more apparent, right? So you're now maturing and building up this whole picture. But you need to continually re-verify what you're looking at there, because I find that'll change over time. So as you get more and more familiar with the subject, you're going to get more intel that comes in, and you're going to have to re-verify some of those conclusions that you made, because you may base it on the data that you have at the time, but that, of course, is going to change as you proceed, right? So I've got some examples there of some pretty common things that we see that you could guess would mean one thing, but could later on lead you down another road, right? So recommendation number 2, use sign patterns to continually re-verify conclusions. And it's really good as a team to talk through that, to say, oh, well, we assumed that this person was just a business person, that's why they were only on LinkedIn. But maybe there's other reasons for that, right? Deception. So this is really interesting. A lot of people find deception or evasion techniques as a really bad thing. And the aim of this by the subject is really to slow you down so they can then get the advantage and then move forward, right? So typically that's what it is. Out in the field, sometimes it will even be dangerous to some extent, right? Because not only are they trying to evade you, but they may set up some traps or something like that for you, which you'd have to watch out for. I have not experienced that very much, if at all. I definitely have had some evasion techniques, but typically these are not very useful or not very effective, because most people, I find, are just really bad at it. So they're trying to cover their tracks. You know, the classic thing maybe is walking backwards or doing a circle or things like that. Unless they're getting in a vehicle and getting driven away, I mean, that would be bad. But a lot of these things don't work out that well, because all the effort it takes for them to do that is just creating more sign for me to detect, right? And it also consumes a bunch of their time. So if you're in the woods and I'm tracking you, you're way faster than me, because I have to talk to command, I have to get on my knees and establish the track pattern and do all these things, worry about my safety, my team safety, and you're way faster than me. But if you stop to brush your tracks with a branch, you know, thanks, because now you're moving a lot slower. So that's great. And you know, sometimes if you're going across a river or something like that, you think, okay, that's going to do the trick as well. But quite often you can see changes in the river as well, right? And then we'll just send 2 teams down the river on each side, and we'll eventually usually find you. So there's things like that. And then on the OSINT side, it's very similar, right? So we see people sometimes, especially with, say, child, when they abduct a child, we'll see them trying to cover their tracks, where they're deleting content and things like that. And that gives us a pretty clear picture of their intent and what they're trying to do. So useful for law enforcement. So it's interesting, right? And then how are they doing communications? How are they communicating with the public and then also amongst themselves? So they maybe move to a more private communications, or maybe through gaming or things like that. So understanding that. And then also aliases. Generally criminal activity, they use a lot of aliases, which is interesting. And you can usually get those from, in Canada, we can look in the court records and stuff like that to see that. So I don't worry too much about deception or evasion, and I actually look forward to it when I see it. So recommendation number 12 is deception techniques often form a sign pattern, which is what we're trying to do, right? So it's actually more useful than not, quite often, I find. So now, overall approach, so a bit of a summary here about some of the things we've talked about, right? Just to sum it all up. So first of all, be prepared. So if you're doing your OSINT, learn from the trackers, just be prepared. And that means going through your kit, going through your applications, your tools, your training, your team. How well do you know your team? Are you guys ready? Have you talked about it? What's your plan? If it's just a CTF, what is your plan going into it, right? How are you going to approach it? Who's doing what? Understand the mission. So when you go in, you know, on a CTF, it's fairly clear. You know, you probably have 4 subjects, but who's doing what? Are you going to divide and conquer, or are you all going to focus on one person, right? What does that look like? Do you understand all your skill sets and what that's going to be like? When are you going to take breaks? So understand how that's going to work. So we talked about sign pattern, and finally the tracking story and the linkage between those, right? So we have a bit of we mature as we progress through sign pattern, and tracking story. And that's going to help you a lot. I don't see that very much on the OSINT side, but I think you can definitely take that framework and move it over. So the mandate, we talked about the self-team subject and also the tracking mandate. You can create your own mandate if you want with your team, right, on what's important to you. Those were 2 examples that work well for me within that community. But on the OSINT side, maybe it's going to be different. Maybe you're going to take some of that and change it. And I'd love to see that if it's in work anywhere, right? So if you're developing something like that, I'd love to hear about it. And then be ready to shift your mindset and approach. So we're talking about tracking, we're talking about OSINT, which is kind of the virtual tracking. But at some point, you have to move beyond that, and because you won't find signs. So you have to kind of move to that hunter mindset of anticipating where that subject is going to go. And then once you understand your subject, deception techniques, evasion techniques are not as scary as we tend to think that they are. This is a screenshot of all the different recommendations that I've given you, all 12. I thought it might be nice to just put this here so you have a quick summary of that. And that concludes my presentation. So I don't know if we have any time for questions or not.
Not really.
Okay.
But thank you very much. A big
Sure.
round of applause for this presentation. And again, for Q&A, please ping in the app, because we're going to go guide you down to the interview room now and do an interview that will be broadcasted on the internet. People